All right, let's start. Benzedrine pills. In 1940, the British War Office placed an order for 72 million tablets. Not ammunition, not rations. Tablets. Small, white, unremarkable pills that fit in a breast pocket alongside a photograph of home. The soldiers who swallowed them didn't feel tired anymore. They didn't feel afraid. They felt, for a few hours, like they could win the war by themselves. The drug was Benzedrine, the amphetamine that governments on both sides of the Second World War decided was as essential as a rifle. Before Benzedrine, military planners had no answer for the simple, brutal fact of human exhaustion. Men needed sleep. Battles didn't wait for sleep. The gap between what a soldier's body could sustain and what a modern industrial war demanded had always been filled with willpower and discipline, and, when those ran out, catastrophic collapse. Benzedrine closed that gap chemically. The United States military distributed approximately 250 million Benzedrine tablets during the war. Fighter pilots flew 36-hour missions without closing their eyes. Bomber crews crossed the Atlantic and came back and crossed it again. The drug was listed in official U.S. military field manuals as a fatigue fighter. No addiction warning. No dosage ceiling beyond which a soldier was advised to stop. It sat in the ration kit alongside chocolate and cigarettes, normalized by proximity to comfort. German forces were simultaneously issuing Pervitin, their own methamphetamine variant, which meant both sides of the war were chemically sustaining their men past the point human biology was designed to reach. What the field manuals didn't print was the return journey. The United States Food and Drug Administration did not classify Benzedrine as a controlled substance until 1965, 2 decades after mass military distribution had ended. By then, an entire generation of veterans had come home habituated to amphetamines and found a civilian world that offered no equivalent replacement. The first wave of the modern stimulant epidemic didn't begin in a back alley. It began in a government warehouse. The pills won battles. The come-down lasted decades, and the question that the official record has never fully answered is whether the men who designed that program ever seriously weighed the cost of what they were sending those soldiers home as against what they needed them to be in the field. If they did, the math they used has never been published. Combat morphine. During the Vietnam War, the United States Army issued individual morphine syringes directly to enlisted soldiers in the field. A single self-injectable dose, preloaded, small enough to clip to a dog tag. The logic was sound. A man screaming from a wound cannot fight. A man chemically sedated can at least be moved. Field medics called it mercy. What happened next was something the Army's own internal assessments described, in language that was later classified, as a consequence they had anticipated and accepted. Morphine syrettes had been standard U.S. military first aid kit items since the Second World War. In previous conflicts, the exposure had been managed, in theory, by field medic control and the relatively short duration of acute combat. Vietnam broke that theory completely. Tours lasted a year. The fighting was asymmetric and relentless. The enemy was invisible, and the jungle was enormous, and the psychological weight of a war without clear front lines produced something that field surgery had no protocol to treat. A 1971 congressional study found that 34% of U.S. soldiers in Vietnam had used heroin at least once. 20% showed signs of addiction. The Nixon administration's response was Operation Golden Flow, a program that tested returning soldiers for opiates before discharge. It was presented publicly as a clean break, a medical checkpoint between the war and civilian life. It was quietly abandoned when the political cost of its findings became clear. The data it generated on addiction rates among returning veterans was never fully published. What the VA hospitals received instead was the men themselves, and the hospitals were not ready for them. The deeper record is more troubling. VA internal studies from the 1970s suggested that up to 40% of Vietnam-era opioid dependency cases were directly traceable to field-issued morphine, not to street drugs obtained after discharge. Those studies were not released. What was released were the VA's official intake numbers, which the agency described in public statements as higher than expected, a phrase that contains within it an entire suppressed history. In the First World War, British soldiers were issued morphine tablets in tins stamped with the regimental crest. The implication was clear even then. The drug was as institutional as the uniform. Every military command that ever issued opiates to frontline soldiers knew what it was trading. Short-term performance for long-term dependency. The mission was now. The addiction was downstream. The metal goes on the chest. The needle goes in the arm. History only photographs one of them. Pervitin. In May of 1940, the German Wehrmacht consumed 35 million tablets of methamphetamine in 3 weeks. The panzer divisions that broke through the Ardennes and drove to the English Channel in a movement that stunned every military analyst in Europe. The armored thrust that effectively ended France as a military power in a matter of days were sustained not by superior training alone, not by tactical genius alone, but by methamphetamine. The drug was called Pervitin, and without it, the Blitzkrieg as history knows it was almost certainly impossible. Pervitin was manufactured by Temmler Pharmaceuticals in Berlin and had been commercially available in Germany since 1938, marketed initially as a productivity aid for civilians. German military doctor Otto Ranke recognized its potential for sustained combat performance and made his case to Wehrmacht High Command in a 1939 memo. By the Polish campaign, it was being distributed to frontline troops. By France, it was policy. The armored divisions driving through the Ardennes did so continuously for 72 hours, and beyond, crews staying awake and functional past any biological threshold they could have crossed without chemical assistance. The Wehrmacht's own medical logs from the French campaign document the side effects alongside the performance data. Paranoia, cardiac events, hallucinations in soldiers who had been awake for 4 days, reports of men who could not stop moving even when ordered to halt, whose nervous systems had been wound so tight by the drug that rest had become physically impossible. By 1941, addiction rates among officers were severe enough that Pervitin was reclassified under the Reich Opium Law. Distribution to frontline troops continued regardless. Historian Norman Ohler's 2015 book Blitzed drew on Wehrmacht pharmaceutical records that the German government had kept sealed for 70 years. What those records showed was a military command that understood it was running its men on borrowed neurological time and made the calculation anyway. The speed of conquest was worth the cost. And at the top of the command structure, the calculation was even more personal. Adolf Hitler received intravenous methamphetamine injections throughout the war from his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell. The escalating irrationality of Hitler's strategic decisions in 1944 and 1945 correlates precisely with documented increases in his dosage schedule. If the most terrifying military advance in modern history required 35 million doses of methamphetamine to execute, the question worth sitting with is this: how many other brilliant campaigns, in how many other wars, have we never looked inside of? Fentanyl citrate. On the night of October 23, 2002, Russian Spetsnaz forces pumped an aerosolized chemical agent into the ventilation system of the Dubrovka Theater in Moscow. Inside were approximately 850 hostages and 40 Chechen militants who had wired the building with explosives. The assault worked. The militants were neutralized. Then the hostages began to stop breathing. 130 people died. Not from the Chechens, but from whatever Russia had put in the air. The Russian government has never officially disclosed what the agent was. The physicians treating the dying were refused that information for hours after the assault ended. Fentanyl citrate is a synthetic opioid approximately 100 times more potent than morphine. In legitimate military medicine, it is issued to U.S. Special Operations Forces in oral transmucosal form, a lozenge on a stick, for rapid pain management in the field without the need for injection equipment. The pharmacological profile of the Dubrovka casualties respiratory depression, rapid onset, mass unconsciousness, matched an aerosolized opioid compound consistent with a fentanyl derivative. Naloxone, the standard opioid reversal agent, was not staged at the scene for mass casualty treatment. The Russian government had planned the assault in detail. The antidote was not part of the plan. The gap between fentanyl as battlefield medicine and fentanyl as a weapons-grade incapacitating agent is narrower than the official architecture of international law acknowledges. The Chemical Weapons Convention explicitly prohibits the military use of riot control agents in warfare. It contains a specific carve-out for law enforcement applications, a loophole that several governments have used to fund research into aerosolized incapacitating agents under non-lethal classifications. DARPA and NATO have both maintained documented funding streams in this direction. Research that officially stopped under the CWC framework, but has continued under different terminology. The surviving Dubrovka hostages include people who retain no memory of the assault itself, only of watching the people beside them stop breathing and being unable to move or call for help. The Russian government settled compensation claims quietly, out of court, under terms that required non-disclosure. The full casualty analysis was never published. What the theater attack demonstrated to every military pharmacologist who studied it was that the line between a battlefield analgesic and a chemical weapon is not a scientific distinction. It is a political one. The line between medicine and weapon has always been a matter of who is holding the syringe. In Moscow, in 2002, the world watched what happens when the answer to that question is a government that trusts its own math more than the lives in the room. Ketamine sedation. Ketamine was first synthesized in 1962 by Park Davis Pharmaceuticals as a battlefield anesthetic with a specific advantage over every existing option. It maintained breathing reflexes. A soldier in a field hospital under conventional anesthesia needed a ventilator. Under ketamine, he kept breathing on his own. The U.S. Army tested it on human volunteers at the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland in 1964. Within 2 years, it was deployed in Vietnam. Within a decade, the same compound that was saving lives in field surgery was appearing in a different kind of government document entirely. Edgewood Arsenal records, partially declassified in 1993, show that ketamine was evaluated as a behavior modification compound before it was approved as a clinical anesthetic. The distinction mattered to the researchers. It apparently did not matter to the program. The CIA's interest in ketamine was pharmacological and specific. At sufficient doses, the drug produces anterograde amnesia. Subjects cannot form reliable memories of what occurs during administration. They may respond to questions, follow instructions, appear coherent, and retain nothing afterward. In legitimate medicine, this is called a side effect. In an interrogation context, it is the primary feature. The 2014 Senate Intelligence Committee report on CIA detention and interrogation programs references medical procedures administered to detainees at black sites in language that is deliberately opaque. Former detainees and their legal representatives have described experiences consistent with dissociative anesthetic administration. Extraordinary rendition flights, documented by the European Court of Human Rights as systematic transfers of detainees across borders outside any legal framework, consistently listed a medical officer among crew. Multiple flight manifests from the program's peak years share that detail. The U.S. military's Tactical Combat Casualty Care Guidelines formally added ketamine as a primary battlefield analgesic in 2012, the same period that saw the highest volume of extraordinary rendition activity in the program's documented history. The timing is not evidence of coordination. It is simply a reminder that the same compound occupying a legitimate place in the military medical manual can occupy a very different place in a classified annex, and that the legitimacy of one use has always provided cover for scrutiny of the other. When a drug erases the memory of what was done to you, who decides whether a crime was committed? The answer, in every documented case, has been the institution that administered it. Scopolamine, before waterboarding, before sleep deprivation, before every technique now associated with the vocabulary of enhanced interrogation, there was scopolamine. And unlike the legends that surround most truth serum mythology, this one is documented. The program was real. The code name was real. The files, or at least the ones that survived, are real. What happened inside them is something official history has chosen, with considerable deliberateness, not to teach. Scopolamine is an anticholinergic compound derived from the nightshade plant family. It causes disorientation, suppressed inhibition, and at sufficient doses, a state researchers have described as conscious automatism, in which a subject responds to commands and answers questions while retaining no volitional control over those responses. Texas obstetrician Robert Ernest House coined the term truth serum in 1922 after observing that women administered scopolamine during childbirth answered questions with unusual candor. House published his findings. The Office of Strategic Services, forerunner to the CIA, was reading. By 1942, the OSS had formally evaluated scopolamine as an interrogation tool. Internal documents describe it as partially effective, which in the language of intelligence bureaucracy means effective enough to continue. Project Artichoke, launched by the CIA in 1951, listed scopolamine as a primary candidate for what the project's own documents called chemical interrogation. Artichoke ran for at least 6 years. The files that survived a 1973 destruction order describe a multi-compound approach. Scopolamine combined with sodium pentothal and hypnosis, administered to subjects who did not know what they were receiving. The drug has a modern criminal history that makes the pharmacology viscerally clear. In Colombia, scopolamine is known as burundanga, or devil's breath. Criminal organizations use it as a robbery, an assault facilitator. Victims comply fully with instructions, appear conscious and coherent to witnesses, and retain no memory of the event. The DEA classifies scopolamine as a Schedule III controlled substance. It remains legally available in the United States as a prescription motion sickness patch, a small translucent square the size of a fingernail. The most terrifying interrogation tool ever deployed wasn't a room or a method. It was a patch the size of a postage stamp. And the government that used it didn't develop it in secret. It read about it in a medical journal and recognized what it could become. MK Ultra, LSD. On November 28, 1953, a United States Army scientist named Frank Olson fell from the 10th floor of the Statler Hotel in New York City. He had been secretly dosed with lysergic acid diethylamide 9 days earlier, without his knowledge or consent, by agents of the Central Intelligence Agency. His death was ruled a suicide. In 1994, his family had his body exhumed. A second autopsy, conducted by forensic anthropologist Dr. James Starrs of George Washington University, found blunt force trauma to the skull inconsistent with a fall. The case was reopened. It was never conclusively closed. Project MKUltra ran from 1953 to at least 1973. It encompassed at least 150 individually funded research projects across 80 institutions, including 44 universities. LSD was the primary compound under investigation, obtained initially from Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in Switzerland and later synthesized domestically. The program's stated goal, as articulated in the surviving documentation, was the development of reliable methods for behavior modification, psychological control, and the extraction of information from unwilling subjects. The unstated goal, visible between the lines of the misfiled documents that survived, was something larger: the erasure of identity. Operation Midnight Climax was an MKUltra sub-project that established safe houses in San Francisco and New York, where CIA operatives paid prostitutes to bring unwitting men who were then secretly dosed with LSD, while agents observed through one-way mirrors and recorded the results. The subjects were chosen from populations considered unlikely to be believed: drug addicts, sex workers, mental patients, prisoners. The program ran for years. CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all MKUltra files in January of 1973, anticipating congressional investigation. Approximately 20,000 documents survived, only because they had been misfiled in a financial records building not included in the destruction order. The 1977 Senate testimony that finally brought MKUltra into public record confirmed what the documents showed: that the United States government had tested chemical compounds on individuals without their knowledge or consent, and that some of those compounds had been evaluated for their capacity to permanently destroy a subject's existing personality. The researchers' own internal language, drawn from the Gottlieb files, describes the goal of producing what they called a blank slate. Their own scientists debated, in writing, whether achieving that goal constituted murder. If the government that ran those experiments is the same government that now decides what goes in your body, how much of that trust is actually yours to give? White phosphorus. White phosphorus ignites on contact with oxygen. It burns at 2,760 degrees Fahrenheit. It does not stop burning when submerged in water. When it dries, it reignites. It embeds in skin and burns through muscle and into bone. And the surgeons who remove it must work in darkness because the particles glow. And exposure to air during removal causes them to combust again. Soldiers who encountered it in the Second World War named it Willie Pete. The name was affectionate in the way soldiers name terrible things, as a way of holding at arm's length what the thing actually does. White phosphorus munitions were used extensively in the Allied firebombing campaigns against Dresden and Hamburg. They were used in Korea. They were used in Vietnam. They have been used in nearly every major U.S. military engagement since 1945, and they have been documented in use by Israeli forces in Gaza in 2009, by Saudi-led coalition forces in Yemen in 2016, and by Syrian government forces in Aleppo between 2013 and 2016. White phosphorus is classified under international humanitarian law as an incendiary weapon. Its use against civilian populations is prohibited under Protocol 3 of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. The United States has not ratified Protocol 3. In November of 2004, during the Battle of Fallujah, U.S. forces employed what field commanders described in the Army's own field artillery magazine as a shake-and-bake approach. White phosphorus rounds to flush insurgents from covered positions, followed immediately by high-explosive munitions. The article was published in the March-April 2005 edition and was quietly withdrawn from the publication's online archive after international attention. The tactic it described was not classified. It was documented in a professional military journal as an operational success. American soldiers who handled white phosphorus munitions without full protective equipment filed VA disability claims, citing chemical burns from secondary exposure. A significant number of those initial claims were denied on the grounds that white phosphorus was classified in military procurement law as a smoke munition, not a chemical weapon. The distinction exists on paper. It does not exist in human tissue. Several Fallujah veterans have described in statements to advocacy organizations the specific psychological weight of white phosphorus, the experience of witnessing what it does to a body, and then being ordered not to discuss what they had seen. You can rename a fire. You cannot rename what it does to a person. The legal architecture that separates white phosphorus from a chemical weapon is one of the most precisely engineered fictions in the history of warfare, and it has been maintained consistently by the governments with the largest stockpiles. BZ Agent. Sometime in the late 1950s, a group of United States Army volunteers reported to the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. They had signed consent forms. The forms did not describe the compound they were about to receive. What happened next lasted, in some cases, for 4 days. Subjects lost contact with reality so completely that they could not recognize commanding officers or fellow soldiers. One man attempted to climb a non-existent staircase for 6 hours. Another held a conversation with a person who was not in the room. When it was over, they were interviewed and sent home. Some of them are still waiting for a full explanation of what was done to them. The compound was BZ, formerly designated 3-quinaclidinyl benzylate, NATO code BZ. It is a powerful anticholinergic hallucinogen, more potent than LSD, and far longer lasting, capable of producing psychosis lasting between 72 and 96 hours. The United States Army tested it on approximately 5,000 American soldiers at Edgewood between 1955 and 1975. The consent forms those soldiers signed did not accurately describe the compounds being administered. A 1975 Army Inspector General report confirmed the testing. A 1994 Government Accountability Office report confirmed the scale. The VA did not formally acknowledge the program's existence to affected veterans until 1993. BZ was not an experiment that failed and was shelved. It was standardized as a U.S. military weapon in 1961. The M43 cluster bomb and the M44 generator were both designed for BZ delivery. The compound remained in the U.S. arsenal until 1990. A 1975 Edgewood document, partially declassified, characterizes BZ as the ideal incapacitating agent because it produces a state in which subjects cannot coordinate resistance, cannot form reliable memories of what occurred, and cannot accurately report their experiences afterward. The document notes all three properties with equal weight. The inability to report accurately is listed as a feature. The Yugoslav army was investigated for alleged BZ use during the Bosnian conflict in 1995. The United Nations inquiry found traces of BZ precursor compounds in soil samples from the area. The findings were classified as inconclusive. Edgewood veterans who participated in BZ trials have documented persistent cognitive deficits, recurring hallucinatory episodes, and psychiatric diagnoses that emerged years after exposure. Several have given oral testimony describing interviews conducted after BZ administration by men in civilian clothes who asked questions about their political beliefs and their willingness to follow orders that violated their conscience. Those interviews do not appear in the published trial documentation. If your own army can legally dissolve your mind for 3 days and classify the records, what exactly is the line between soldier and subject? Soviet psychotronic weapons. In 1983, the United States Defense Intelligence Agency produced a classified report titled Soviet and Czechoslovakian Parapsychology Research. Its conclusion was precise and extraordinary. The Soviet Union was spending the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars on a weapons program designed to destroy the human mind without touching the body. No bullet, no chemical agent, no surgery. The weapon the Soviets were developing operated at a distance. Its target was cognition itself, the capacity to think clearly, to resist, to know what was real. The Soviet psychotronic weapons program operated under various designations within the GRU and KGB from the 1950s through at least the 1980s. It combined pharmaceutical research, electromagnetic frequency technology, and psychological conditioning into a unified effort aimed at what Soviet researchers called remote influence of enemy personnel. Dr. Igor Smirnov of Moscow Medical Academy developed a psychocorrection technology in the 1980s. Subliminal audio signals embedded in ambient noise, capable of altering emotional states, and, according to Smirnov's own published claims, implanting specific thoughts without the subject's awareness. In 1993, FBI officials met with Smirnov and were briefed on potential applications during the Waco siege. The meeting is documented. The Moscow signal runs from 1953 to 1976. For more than 2 decades, the Soviet government directed a microwave frequency at the United States Embassy in Moscow. Embassy staff were not informed. The State Department studied the health effects on personnel and classified the results. Ambassador Walter Stussel developed a rare blood disorder during his posting. He died of leukemia in 1986. The full epidemiological data from the Moscow signal period has never been released. Then came Havana. Beginning in 2016, U.S. Embassy personnel in Havana, Cuba began reporting sudden onset headaches, memory loss, cognitive impairment, and a directional sensation of pressure. The same symptoms then appeared in CIA officers in Vienna, Tbilisi, and Bogota. In 2020, a National Academy of Sciences panel concluded that directed pulsed radio frequency energy was the most plausible explanation. That report was released on a Friday afternoon in December, during the week the United States passed its pandemic relief legislation. It received 48 hours of coverage and then disappeared from the news cycle. Every weapon on this list required a soldier to know they were being used as one. This one didn't. That's not a military advancement. That's a different kind of war entirely. And it has already started. 10 items. 10 programs, compounds, weapons, and decisions that the official record either classified, buried, or quietly withdrew from public archives. But read them together and a single pattern emerges. Every government that developed these tools made the same internal calculation that the mission, whatever it was at that moment, was worth more than what was being done to the people executing it. The soldier who swallowed the Benzedrine, the veteran flooded with morphine, the civilian who stopped breathing in a Moscow theater, the Edgewood volunteer who climbed a staircase that wasn't there, the diplomat in Havana who couldn't remember the word for what was happening to him. History tends to record the decision and omit the cost. The cost is what this video was actually about. If you found it here, you already knew to look past the official version. Subscribe and stay in the archive. The next file is already open. The deepest military secrets are never about weapons. They are about the decision to use a human being as one, and the paperwork filed afterward to ensure no one asks why.